you remember your roots.
All right, thank you, Dr. Sybil. So thank you all for coming today. There's a little bit of change of plans getting in here, but again, thank you for coming to Crop Physiology Day. So when we think about crop physiology, one of the things that sometimes we can forget about is the roots. So we really have to remember our roots. They're really important. But if we're not at Crop Physiology Day and I say, remember your roots, the first thing I think of is back home. And so back home on the farm, I listen to a lot of Garth Brooks, and I really like one of his songs, Friends in Low Places. I won't sing it for you, but it starts out, blame it all on my roots, I showed up in boots, and ruined your black tie affair. Well, I hope I didn't ruin any black tie affair, but I did show up in my boots, and I do blame that on my roots. And today I'm going to blame a lot of my yield results on the roots. And so to do that, we have to study the roots and put on our boots. And we have to go dig and wash the roots. And so we have our new students that come in, and we always have to give them the opportunity to wash roots. You can tell that they're just loving it. Deep down, they love it. But what they really need is a little motivation. And so to motivate them, obviously we got to give them some food. And that might be some of the motivation that you had here today. Hopefully it was to learn, but food is a great motivator. And so after they have some food in their bellies, they're happy, and they're happy to come back and study and do more root washing. And after we washed these roots, we did a lot of different hybrids, and we were really seeing that hybrids differ a lot in the rooting. I mean, you'd be shocked in the variation from one hybrid to another. And so we saw this in when I was doing my master's, and I got really interested and wanted to study it as a Ph.D. And so my first research objective is to characterize hybrids based on their root architecture. And so to do that, we have to actually measure them. And there's not a lot of great ways to measure roots, believe it or not. But Dr. Drift and Dr. Bone from the University of Illinois developed the corn root observation platform, or otherwise known as the crop. And so this is able to tell us an estimate of root surface area, root angle, and a lot of other root measurements that we can use. And we also weigh them as well. And so we dug a lot of different hybrids. We did Bex. I wanted to do Bex because I heard I might get a free gator, but I'm still waiting on that. But Bex is, I really like working with Bex. They're really the forefront of root research. And one unique thing about them is they have a lot of different germplasms. They have some Bayer, they have some Corteva, they have some Golden Harvest. And so I dug 8 different hybrids from Bex. And then we imaged them, and so you can see this is the influence of hybrid on root surface area. And there's a big difference between different hybrids. And so I wanted to categorize them. So what I did is I took the average and I drew that average. And so above that line, I'd have a large surface area, and below that line, I'd have a small surface area. And so I did the same thing with root angle, and the root angle is very different between hybrids as well. And again, I drew that mean. So we got some above the line, we have our larger root, or our wider angles, and below that line, we have our narrower angles. And we also weighed the roots and did that with root mass. And again, draw that line, large root mass, smaller root mass, and you can see that each of the measurements we took, they weren't related, and so they are 3 different measurements. And if you take surface area, angle, and mass and put them together, we can have one single rating. And I showed this to Dr. Beal, and he's like, you gotta come up with a name for that. Well, the acronym for surface area, angle, and mass spells SAM. And so I love that name, so we're calling it the SAM rating. So what it does, as I mentioned, it integrates surface area, angle, and mass into one root characterization per hybrid. It separates each measurement into 2 groups: surface area, small, large, angle, narrow or wide, and mass into small or large. So 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. So 8 different SAM ratings to help us categorize the root architecture. So I can show you bar graphs and data all day long, but what do these roots actually look like? So here I have 5 different roots, and you can see that they're very different. So we're going to go from right to left and walk through it. So on the left, we have a small, narrow, small. And if you think about it, you can kind of picture it in your head. Small surface area, not a lot of roots there. Narrow is growing down, and small, so it's a smaller mass. So that's, in my mind, that's what that would look like. The next one, we have small, wide, small. So it's more of a flat hybrid. Doesn't grow too deep, not too big. Next one's large, wide, small. Maybe sounds a little confusing, but let's think about it. Large surface area, that means we have a lot of fibrous roots, wide angle, and then small mass. So there's a lot of fibrous roots that really don't weigh a whole lot. So lots of thin roots. The next one, we have large, narrow, large. That's growing really deep, deep-rooted hybrid. And then large, wide, large, big roots, small roots, roots everywhere. So now that I've characterized hybrids based on the root architecture, I wanted to use the SAM rating to help explain a hybrid's response to nitrogen management. So what we did is we took these 8 hybrids with the SAM ratings listed, and I applied either 120 pounds pre-plant as a reduced rate of nitrogen. I did a split application of nitrogen where I applied 120 pounds pre-plant and then came back at V6 and Y dropped an additional 60 pounds. Or we applied 180 pounds all up front pre-plant at UAN. And so the effect of, or first we're going to look at the reduced rate of nitrogen on grain yield. And so I have it ordered from highest yield to lowest yield, and I'm always shooting for the high yield. So which one of these hybrids are being most efficient? And these 3 really popped out to me. And then I go and look at the SAM rating. Each of these 3 hybrids have a narrow root architecture. So that's really interesting to me. And so what's actually happening is we know that nitrogen moves down. If there's a reduced rate, it's going to be less there. So that hybrid has to grow down. So if it's narrow, it's growing down, not out to get to that nitrogen. It's also not growing out and stealing it from its neighboring plants either. So now we're going to look at the grain yield response to a split nitrogen application. So we have each hybrid with their SAM rating. We have our 180 pounds of nitrogen, our yields, and then we have the response to whether it liked the split application in green or if it didn't like it in red. And so first let's look at the ones that liked it. We want positive responses. And 3 out of those 4 hybrids had a large surface area and a wide angle. Now, I'll be honest, this kind of confused me at first. I would have thought that the better placed nitrogen as a wide drop right along that row would have been better for maybe a smaller surface area hybrid. That's not what I saw. But then I thought about it, and maybe it's more of a timing aspect. If it has a larger surface area, maybe it's actually growing later into the season than maybe a smaller surface area. So it needs that nitrogen a little bit later on. And so that's one of the theories that I had. So now we're going to look at the ones that didn't like that split application. They would have preferred all their nitrogen up front. And then 3 out of the 4 ones had a small surface area. So again, not what I expected, but we do know that hybrids need a certain amount of nitrogen up front to really prime the plant. They need to sense that nutrition early on so they can put that yield potential out as a young plant. And so these small surface area plants, maybe they know that they're not going to be able to grow as much and they really need that nitrogen up front. So you might be thinking, well, what about that last hybrid? I had a 21 bushel decrease. Well, still looking into what's going on with that. If I didn't have it up there, then maybe I'd make the data up, but research isn't always perfect, and we don't always get what we would expect. But the key takeaways is that hybrids can be categorized into a SAM rating based on root parameters, which can help explain our response to nitrogen. And that reduced rate of nitrogen, the narrow-rooted hybrids really perform the best. And then hybrids with the large root surface area tended to respond better to that split nitrogen application, whereas the small root surface area rooted hybrids really favored that full upfront rate. So next I wanted to take a step and we know that some managements can actually change the root mass. And so if you were here last year or seen us previously, we know that plant population has a big impact on root mass. So I wanted to take this and I wanted to use the SAM rating to help interpret a hybrid's response to plant population. And so what I did is I took two different hybrids, one with a large surface area, wide angle, small mass, and one with a small, narrow, small SAM rating. And I planted them at 28,000 plants per acre, 34,000, and 40,000. So we're really trying to push it a little bit with that 40,000 plants per acre. And so how does population affect our SAM rating components? Well, first we'll look at surface area. 28,000 going to 34,000 we decrease, and then 40,000 we decrease some more. So as we increase our plant population, we decrease our surface area. What about root angle? Root angle is really interesting to me. So at that low plant population, it had a little bit of a wider angle, but when we really start to put more plants out there, it has more neighbors, and so it has to actually narrow it up a little bit. And there was a little bit of a threshold because we decreased going from 28 to 34, and then 34 to 40, so there's no difference. So what about root mass? And so this is one that we've seen year after year. As we increase our plant population, we decrease our root mass. In fact, if you do the math, there's a 2.5% decrease in root mass per 1,000 plant increase in population. And we see this year after year. We published this in 2018. We've done other studies. This is very, very consistent. And so if we're shooting for high yields, we have this small root mass. So what's that going to do to the yield? So now we're going to look at the effect of population and hybrid on grain yield. And so first, I'll start with this large, wide, small hybrid. 28,000 to 34,000, no change. But when we go to 40,000 plants per acre, it's just too much. So that's where we had a 10 bushel decrease. But in this smaller rooted hybrid, there is really not much of a change there. So, they wanted to see what was going on. So we have some other similar studies with different hybrids and different managements. So I went and took a look at them. And so what we have is we have two hybrids from Golden Harvest, with a SAM rating of large, wide, large, and small, narrow, small. We planted them in both 30-inch rows and in 20-inch rows at 34,000 plants per acre and at 42,000 plants per acre. So really pushing that plant population. And so at 30-inch rows, 34,000, both of them did fairly well. But when we went to 42,000, it was just too much. It was dry. We decreased on both of them. But when we went from 34 in a 30-inch row to 34 in a 20-inch row, our larger rooted hybrid had a 12 bushel increase going from wide rows to narrow rows. But we didn't see much of a change with that smaller rooted hybrid. So interesting. But what if we put more plants out there? We had an additional 16 on top of that 281 in our large, wide, large hybrid. And we had a 30 bushel increase with that smaller hybrid. So I'm like, this is a little bit of what I've seen, but why is this occurring? And so I'm a picture guy. I like to visualize. And so first we're going to start with our large, wide, large hybrid, 30-inch row, 34,000 plants per acre. And I'm a John Deere guy, so we're going to plant it with our John Deere tractor. And the whole concept behind this theory is that roots don't like to touch. Think of three kids in the back seat when I'm growing up, bumping elbows. You're touching me, you're touching me. My mom's up here, she's laughing because she knows exactly what I'm talking about. But 3 kids in the back seat. Then we go to 42,000 plants per acre. We're shoving a 4th kid in the back seat, and we're planting that, and we're really starting to touch roots. Roots don't like to touch. We have an 8 bushel loss. Now, what if we go to a 20-inch row? We narrow the rows, but we increase our plant-to-plant spacing. So when we plant that, then we have more space between plants. Our roots aren't touching anymore. That's where we get a 12 bushel increase. But what about 42,000? Is that going to be too much? We plant that again. Think about it, our roots aren't quite touching, and so we had an additional 16 bushels on top of that. And so if we were to go a little bit higher, that's where we might see it start to decrease because your roots are starting to touch and they're starting to compete with the other neighboring plants. Now what about that small, narrow, small hybrid? We plant at 34,000 plants per acre, and there's plenty of space between the roots. What about 42,000 plants per acre? Come back, plant that. There's a little bit of space between the roots, but this was done last year, and we had a drought. So it was just too high of a population. A small root hybrid isn't able to access that moisture, and so we did still see a 10 bushel loss. But what about 20-inch rows at 34,000 plants per acre? We plant that, we increase our plant-to-plant spacing, but there's really no difference. Well, think about it. If we're up here, we're not touching roots, we're really not too stressed. So if we go from a not stressed environment to another not stressed environment, there's going to be no change. But what we really need is more plants. Think of Dr. Sybil talking earlier, one of the yield components is plants per acre. So if we put more plants per acre out there, that's where we see that huge increase. We're still not touching roots. We might even be able to go higher on our plant population, get more plants out there and increase it even more. So that's this concept this theory that I have for the roots. And so the key takeaways is small, narrow-rooted hybrids may be suited for narrow rows at higher plant population. Whereas the large, wide-angle hybrids, they did respond to that higher density, but they might be a little more limited. And you're able to put those large, wide-angle hybrids in narrow rows at those lower plant populations. And I just want to make sure that we remember our roots when making management decisions. Hybrid is one of the most important management decisions that a farmer can make, so it's really important to put it on the right soil type, on the right management, and make sure you fit the hybrid that you're working with to the management that you do. And Miranda Oaks is actually going to continue on talking about hybrids and management, and so if I don't have any questions, I'm going to hand it off to her. Yes? So the question was, as we increase our plant population, we decrease our root mass. But what happens to that root mass per plant? But what about on a root mass per acre basis? Since we have more plants out there, less roots per plant, what we actually see is we have the same amount of roots per acre. It doesn't change. We do see greater biomass above ground per acre as we increase. So that means that we have to support more above ground biomass per acre with the same amount of roots.
Got one more question, Sam?
So the question was, have I looked at ear flex and is there a relationship between roots and ear flex and plant population? I haven't looked into it as much myself. I know Dr. Scott Foxhoven looked into it a little bit. I don't remember his data, but we can talk about that after a little bit.
Great question. All right, we're going to move on. Thank you so much, Sam.